It is a Saturday morning in Chicago, the 24th of July, 1915, 7:28, by the clocks along the river. The excursion steamer Eastland is tied to her dock on the south bank of the Chicago River between Clark Street and LaSalle, and she is full, some 2,500 people aboard, most of them factory workers and their families dressed for a summer picnic. She has been leaning for some time now, slowly. First a little to one side, then back, then over toward the river, away from the wharf. The crew have been trying to correct it. Passengers on the open decks feel the tilt and laugh, or grab a railing, or slide a few inches across the polished boards. And then she does not come back. The lean simply continues, 5 degrees, 10, 20, past the point where anything on deck can stand. In a matter of moments, the Eastland rolls onto her side and settles into the river, still made fast to her dock. She is 20 feet from dry land. The water beneath her is 20 feet deep. 844 people will die here, most of them within sight of the street, not at sea, not in a storm, at a dock, in a river, in a great city, on a clear summer morning. One question runs through everything that follows. Why did a ship capsize while she was standing still? To answer it, we have to go back 12 years to the yard where she was built. The Eastland was launched in the spring of 1903 from the Jenks Shipbuilding Company at Port Huron, Michigan. She was a handsome vessel, 265 feet long, narrow in the beam at about 38 feet, with twin funnels and twin triple-expansion steam engines built for speed. On the Great Lakes, she earned a reputation as a fast boat, one of the quick ones on the passenger runs. But speed on a shallow draft hull comes at a cost, and the cost was stability. A ship stays upright because her weight sits low and her buoyancy spreads wide. The lower the center of gravity, the harder she is to tip. The measure of it had a name the era's naval architects used plainly. It was the metacentric height, the distance between a ship's center of gravity and the point about which she rolls, and the practice of the time was to keep that distance positive and ample, so that a heeling ship would push herself back upright. On a vessel that carried her weight high, the margin was thin, and it could be spent by the load above the waterline. The Eastland was built tall and lean for a shallow route, and from the beginning she carried her weight high. Sailors have a word for a vessel like this. They call her tender, quick to lean and slow to right herself, sensitive to every shift of load above the waterline. She was designed to carry perhaps 500 passengers. The number a ship could lawfully board was not left to her owners. It was set by the federal steamboat inspectors, who issued a certificate stating how many she was permitted to carry. Over the years, the Eastland certificate was raised and raised again, until by 1915 she was licensed for 2,500, 5 times her original intent. More people meant more weight, and much of that weight stood on her upper decks, exactly where a tender ship can least afford it. The Eastland's builders and owners were told, not once, repeatedly, and years before the disaster, the 17th of July, 1904. The Eastland is leaving South Haven, Michigan, heavily loaded. She takes a sudden list, leaning hard enough that order among the passengers breaks down, and the crew resort to turning fire hoses on the decks to move people and check the panic. She does not capsize that day, but she comes close, and it is remembered. The 5th of August, 1906. Another listing incident, serious enough to draw formal complaints and questions about whether the ship was safe as loaded. And then the 1st of July, 1912, at Cleveland. The Eastland heels over to something like 25 degrees, while passengers are still boarding before she has even left the wharf. 25 degrees at rest, at a dock. It is almost a rehearsal for what is coming. 3 separate incidents, spread across 8 years, each one saying the same thing in the same plain language. This ship becomes unstable when she is full, and her weight rides high. A naval engineer put the warning in writing to the government inspectors in 1913, a letter later reprinted that laid out the danger directly. The concern was on the record. It was simply never acted upon in a way that changed the outcome. The people who gathered at the Clark Street dock that Saturday knew none of this and had no reason to. They worked for the Western Electric Company at the sprawling Hawthorne Works out in Cicero, a plant that made telephone equipment for much of the country and employed thousands. This was the annual company picnic, a day out across the lake at Michigan City, Indiana. Whole departments had signed up. Whole families came, parents and children, sweethearts and neighbors. For many of them, immigrants who worked long weeks, a chartered steamer, and a summer afternoon by the water was the event of the year. A great number were Czech families from the neighborhoods around the plant. The Eastland was one of 5 steamers hired for the day. Boarding began around 6:30 in the morning. People came down the gangway in their picnic clothes, the women in long skirts and summer hats, the men in straw boaters. A band was aboard. There was music and the ordinary happy noise of a crowd going somewhere pleasant. By about 7:10, the Eastland had taken on her full complement, roughly 2,500 souls. Picture the upper decks, open promenades crowded rail to rail, people leaning out to wave, drifting toward whichever side offered the better view. On a stable ship, that drift means nothing. On the Eastland, it meant everything. What follows is a matter of minutes. The sequence is the explanation. As passengers boarded, the ship first leaned toward the wharf, then away from it, toward the open river. The crew worked the ballast, the tanks low in the hull that are flooded or emptied to trim a vessel and hold her level. They admitted water to try to correct the list. It made little difference. The lean toward the river grew. A little after 7, the deck was noticeably tilted. Loose objects began to slide. In the galley, refrigerators and crockery shifted. Water started to come in through the lower port gangways and portholes, low on the side that was going down, and as it came in, it added weight exactly where the ship could least bear it and pulled her further over. Each degree of list made the next degree easier. At 7:28, the Eastland gave up the fight. She rolled onto her port side and lay down in the river, coming to rest on the bottom 20 feet below. Everything on the open decks went into the water, hundreds of people at once, in their heavy summer clothes, into a narrow, dirty, deep river channel between the hull and the dock. Many more were trapped inside the ship as she turned, in cabins and stairwells and the enclosed lower decks, where the water rose and the way out was suddenly sideways or above them. The rescue began within seconds because thousands of people were watching from the wharf and the bridges. Deckhands and rivermen threw ropes and boxes and anything that floated. A nearby vessel, the Kenosha, pushed her bow against the exposed hull so survivors could scramble across. Workers cut into the steel plates of the upturned hull with torches to reach those trapped inside. A deckhand from another steamer drowned trying to pull people from the water. A Western Electric nurse, Helen Reaper, forced her way through the crowd and took charge of the wounded and the shocked, commandeering ambulances and coordinating the living. But for those caught inside when she rolled, there was very little time and very little that anyone on the outside could do. The dead were carried up the riverbank and laid in a nearby armory, which became a place for families to search. 22 entire families were lost, every member gone in a single morning. Of the 844 who died, a great many were the Czech workers and their children who had come for a day by the lake. Nearly everyone who died was a passenger, working families on a company outing at a dock in the heart of Chicago. Now to the question from the beginning. Why did she go over? The short answer, the one the evidence keeps returning to, is that the Eastland was a top-heavy ship that had been made more top-heavy still, filled beyond her margin of safety, and trimmed by a ballast system that could not save her once the roll began. No single villain. A chain. Start with the design flaw we have already met, a tall, narrow, tender hull that carried her weight high and had a documented history of dangerous listing going back a decade. That was the ground condition. Everything else made it worse. Then the passengers. 2,500 people, many of them standing on the upper decks, live weight, high up, free to move toward whichever side they liked. A stable ship absorbs that. A tender one is at its mercy. Then the ballast. The tanks that should have held her steady were, on that morning, unable to compensate for the shifting load and the water flooding in low on the port side. Filling the tanks helped little once she was already leaning and taking on water through her own openings. And then, the detail that sits at the bitter center of this story. 3 years earlier, the Titanic had gone down for want of lifeboats, and the public demand that followed became law. In March of 1915, 4 months before the disaster, Congress passed the Seamen's Act, championed by Senator Robert La Follette. The act carried a plain requirement, one written straight out of the Titanic. A passenger vessel had to carry lifeboats and rafts for everyone aboard, where before the law had let a ship sail with berths for a fraction of her people. It was a humane rule, and for most ships it saved lives. For the Eastland, that same rule may have helped end them. The new boats and rafts were heavy, and they were mounted high on the vessel, on the very upper decks where she could least afford more weight. A regulation written to prevent one kind of disaster added to this particular already tender ship more of exactly the thing that made her dangerous. The lifeboats meant to protect these passengers helped lift the center of gravity that rolled the ship on top of them. That is the causal chain. A tender ship by design, a listing history ignored for a decade, a full load of shifting passengers, a ballast system overwhelmed, and high overhead, the added weight of safety equipment demanded after the Titanic. Any one of them she might have survived. Together they laid her down at the dock. A grand jury was convened, and its finding entered the record in plain words. The disaster was caused by conditions of instability, brought on by the overloading of passengers, the mishandling of the water ballast, and the ship's faulty construction. Indictments came down against the company's president and officers for manslaughter and against the ship's captain and engineer for criminal carelessness. There was a long fight over extradition, over whether the accused could even be brought to trial. In February of 1916, the court refused to send them. The evidence, it ruled, held barely a scintilla of proof against the accused. Every act charged had been performed in the ordinary course of business and was, in the court's words, more consistent with innocence than with guilt. No one was ever held criminally responsible for the deaths of 844 people. The listing history was documented, the warnings were on paper, the overloading was undisputed, and still, in the end, the law found no one to blame. Families who had lost everyone came away with no verdict. What did change was quieter and slower. The disaster forced hard questions about the inspection and licensing of Great Lakes passenger steamers, about how a ship with the Eastland's record could still be certified to carry 2,500 people. Over the following years, the standards for stability and loading on such vessels were tightened, and the easy raising of a ship's licensed capacity, decade after decade, became harder to justify. Inspectors were expected to weigh a vessel's stability against the load she was certified to carry, so that a hull like the Eastland's could no longer have her permitted number lifted year on year without regard for the margin it spent. The lesson was written in the accumulated caution of inspectors who now had 844 reasons to ask whether a full ship would stay upright. As for the Eastland herself, she was raised from the river on the 14th of August 1915, 3 weeks after she went down. She was sold to the United States Navy, stripped and rebuilt, and served for decades as the training vessel USS Wilmette, a gunboat on the Great Lakes, where a new generation of sailors learned their trade on a hull that most of them never knew had once been the Eastland. She was finally scrapped in the years after the Second World War. The ship outlived the scandal by a lifetime. The families did not. 844 people died. They were telephone workers from the Hawthorne plant. Immigrant families, many of them Czech, who had crossed an ocean to build a life in a Chicago neighborhood and had saved a summer Saturday for a picnic across the lake. Parents who dressed their children in their best clothes that morning. 22 families in which no one came home. No survivor was left to grieve them. Neighbors and co-workers remembered that they had been there at all. They died 20 feet from shore, in front of a watching city, on a ship that had warned everyone for 11 years exactly how she would fail. Not in the deep ocean, not beyond reach. At a dock on a clear morning waiting to leave. Today, a plaque stands on the riverwalk near where she lay, and each summer a small gathering marks the date. The last known position of the Eastland was never a mystery. She never left. That was always the hardest part. 844, it was never a number. It was a picnic.